Hey friends, welcome back. Just Christina here. So today we're going to go over this pamphlet called All America Must Know the Terror That Is Upon Us. It was written by Dr. Revillo P. Oliver. He was a professor at a university in Illinois, and this book was based on a speech that he delivered to the annual Illinois State Convention of the Daughters of the American Revolution. This speech was given on March 12th of 1959. And this book was published in 66 and reprinted in 75. Dr. Oliver has since passed. He died in 1994, regretfully. This was him. He was a very distinguished gentleman. He was world-traveled. He taught philology in Illinois at the university, which means he studied world documents, world pamphlets, and he first started in Italy, where he went and studied documents there. He received a Fulbright Research Fellowship. He first published, his first manuscript was actually in Sanskrit. It was translated. It was called The Little Clay Cart. It was published by his university in Illinois in 1939. During World War II, he was the director of research in a secret agency of the War Department. He was awarded outstanding service to his country. And he was also somebody who was very outwardly outspoken against communism. He spoke against it. He and two of his colleagues formed the John Birch Society, which was also very anti-communistic. Now, please keep in mind that this is from 1959, and everything in here is very dated. So this is going to be a history lesson, if you will. It's going to be a trip back in time to hear about what they were discussing back then regarding Russia and communism and the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Cold War. And even in the end, they discuss fluoridation. So this is 14 pages. We're going to break this up in 2, possibly 3 videos. We'll see how it goes. But for the first part, we're only going to get through the maybe first 4 or 5 pages. So without further ado, let's get started. And I thank you so much for your time and for joining me here. If I stumble, I'll simply correct myself and move on, and I will do my best. So, all America must know the terror that is upon us. You have doubtlessly seen the recent and cleverly advertised book entitled What We Must Know About Communism by Harry and Bonaro Overstreet. It is a strange book. I cannot take time to analyze it or to discuss the possible motives for the author's silence about the most important parts of the vast web of subversion that extends from the humblest primary school to the highest court in our land. But I shall limit myself to matters that the Overstreets ignore or evade, and I can give only the most perfunctory summary of a few selected aspects of the terror that is upon us. I first encountered communists and their allies, the liberal intellectuals, when I was a lad in college, and I then formed the impression of them that so many people of my generation still carry in their minds. The pro-communists among my fellows were so childish and so ignorant. Many of them, to be sure, were glib enough in parroting the phrases and arguments that they had heard or read, but they obviously belonged to the group that worked hard only to avoid hard intellectual work. They talked and they seemed to believe Marxism, a crude and absurd superstition that can be taken serious by no one who has any knowledge of human history or Occidental culture. There was also a few members of the faculty who were obviously pro-communist. Remember that this was years and years ago. And the college in which I was an undergraduate was not so progressive as others even at that time. A few members of the faculty, I say, but they were all teaching that science of education or some similar bunk that was obviously a fraud on the public and an insult to the intelligence of an educated man. My friend and I thought the commies, young and old, were very funny. We had all heard, of course, of what had happened in Russia, but we did not know then what everyone knows now, that the Bolshevik butchery in Russia had been organized in the United States, financed from the United States, and carried out by a gang of 1,700 disciplined assassins, most of whom came from New York City. And in any case, Russia was a distant and barbarous country, and nothing could be more ludicrous than a suggestion that what happened there could conceivably happen here. I spent the war mostly in Washington, in the most secret department of the Army, and my first shock virtually coincided with the beginning of my work there. One of our basic maxims was this: remember that everything that is known in the White House is also known in the Kremlin. That was a shock at the time, although now, of course, everyone who has read at all about communism knows that Roosevelt's assistant, Lachlan Curie, that's Lauchlincurrie, a counterpart of the more recently infamous Sherman Adams, ADAMS, was a communist agent, and that he, with a trained corps of at least 30 traitors, presided over all of the activities of the White House. It was not until later that Harry Hopkins, the man who dispatched to Moscow all of the plans for the atomic bomb, together with the materials necessary to manufacture it, moved into the White House to supervise the work of treason. At that time, Washington was full of communists, both domestic and foreign, and they had already obtained the complete control of most of the governmental bureaus they have held ever since and progressively increased. It was a matter of common knowledge that in many of the civilian agencies, only persons approved by the Communist Party could hold offices of any responsibility. That is, of course, mere commonplace now, and, in informed circles, was mere commonplace then. We all know, for example, that Congressman Dies, D-I-E-S, of Texas, happened to obtain photographs of a part of the communist records which showed that 2,500 members of just 3 governmental departments, State, Justice, and Interior, were card-carrying members of the Communist Party. He took those records to President Roosevelt, who, in one of those fits of almost insane temper to which he was so frequently subject, screamed out, "Many of my best friends are communists," and ordered the congressman from the room. It is not so generally known that a presidential order commanded the Naval Intelligence Service immediately to cease all inquiry into the activities of communists, whether domestic or alien, and to destroy all records concerning communist traitors and spies. Washington was in 1942 what it is today, a city in which, as one bureaucrat complacently assured me, you've got to be a communist to get anywhere. It was even a city in which it was dangerous to be an American. I was there during the obscene farce, in many ways a tragic farce, called the Sedition Trial. Everyone in Washington knew that the one purpose of this trial was to intimidate Americans. Read about it sometime. 30 men and women from all over the country, most of whom had never even heard of one another, and who in common only outspoken criticism of communism, were hauled to Washington in handcuffs and leg irons, imprisoned in cells kept so dark that they could not read, and subjected to the most fantastical trial for conspiracy ever conducted outside Russia or admittedly satellite state. The presiding judge, Eicher, who had, I understand, been appointed on the demand of Felix Frankfurter, was one of the new breed of federal judges, that is to say, viciously corrupt, and he finally died while under impeachment for maleficence in office. The Assistant Attorney General of the U.S., who prosecuted the case, was another protege of Felix Frankfurter, and he was rewarded for his efforts when in 1950 he went to Russia as the personal guest of Stalin. The Hungarian revolt provides one of the hundreds of bits of evidence that show the close cooperation between the Kremlin and the bureaucracy that captured Washington under Franklin Roosevelt and has been expanding and strengthening itself ever since. When the Hungarian people spontaneously rose in revolt, they were, as several refugees have assured me, cozened and confused by lying broadcasts from the radio station that was so sardonically called Radio Free Europe. This station, which, as Fulton Lewis has recently shown, is staffed largely by communist agents, is supported by secret grants from the CIA, and is also supported by funds collected every year from the American people. That is just a bit of communist humor. They delight in tricking Americans into contributing money to ostensibly charitable enterprises for their own destruction. When the Hungarians suffered and died and begged in vain for help, only one nation in Europe dared to offer them even a modicum of assistance. That was Spain, a nation headed by General Francisco Franco, whom the communist-dominated press in the United States so regularly vilifies. Spain agreed to send the Hungarians the weapons they most desperately needed, anti-tank guns. Spain arranged to transport the guns in her own planes and arranged with Germany to permit these planes on their return trip to land to refuel, since the Spanish planes could not carry enough gasoline for a round trip. Now, our Central Intelligence Agency, which seems never able to discover anything to their advantage, or to the advantage of the United States, quickly found out about the Spanish planes to help the Hungarians. The CIA transmitted the information to our State Department, which immediately went into action and brought very strong pressure to bear on the German government to cancel the permission that had been given for the Spanish planes to refuel on their journey. Thus was Washington able to save the Russians considerable inconvenience during their massacre of the Hungarians. The Central Intelligence Agency is an organization so secret that even our senators are not allowed to know anything of its operations. But as we recently disclosed in National Review, the head of any section of this agency has full power to employ even persons whose communist records are in the files of the FBI. The agency has undoubtedly undergone progressive change in the past 9 years. It was in June of 1949, you will remember, that Admiral Hillenkotter, who was then head of the agency, received an inquiry from Senator McCarran concerning 100 new appointees to the United Nations staff. Admiral Hillenkotter replied that according to a preliminary check of his records, 29 of these appointees to the United Nations staff were officers in the Communist Party, and 32 other appointees to the United Nations staff were known members of the Russian espionage system. Admiral Hillenkotter was immediately transferred to a desolate outpost in the Pacific. This was, of course, but one of the many incidents by which our Army and Navy officers have been shown that they dare not do anything that would displease our communist conspirators. I trust that you have not overlooked the latest triumph of which may fairly be called the Washington-Moscow Axis. The Batista government in Cuba was not, to be sure, a perfect government, but it was probably as good of a government as anyone could ever reasonably expect. Batista, however, had committed the one sin that is unforgivable in the eyes of the people who call themselves our liberal intellectuals. He was an enemy of communism. Not only was he a reliable ally of the United States, but he had even gone so far as to sever diplomatic relations with Russia, an act of which greatly embarrassed our State Department. It was clear, therefore, that he must be eliminated. Accordingly, the revolt led by Fidel Castro was organized. You will recall that some of the preparations for it were quite openly made in Florida. Now, although Castro thought it worthwhile to say that he is not himself a member of the Communist Party, his principal assistants, including his brother, were notorious communists, and no reasonable person, even slightly acquainted with Latin American affairs, could ever have doubted that the Castro revolt was a communist operation intended primarily to secure bases for the many Russian submarines which are constantly cruising along our Atlantic coast, and to permit the establishment of rocket bases within 100 miles of our American soil. During the progress of his takeover in Cuba, Castro received supplies from Russian submarines and, of course, vast quantities from the United States. The shipments from Florida were, of course, technically smuggled to him, but oddly enough, our government was never able to interrupt them. But even with this help, Castro would have failed but for the energetic intervention of our State Department. The technique used is, of course, a standard procedure and should be quite familiar to all of us by now. You will recall that when General George Marshall was sent to China to arrange for the communist occupation of that country, he was able to accomplish his mission by simply cutting off from General Chiang Kai-shek the supplies of ammunition that he needed for his soldiers' rifles, which were all, of course, of American manufacture. $150 million worth of ammunition on ships that were about to land was simply dumped into the ocean, and naturally no further shipments were made. Thus, Kai-shek's men could not even use their rifles, to say nothing of machine guns and artillery, and he had to retreat before the communist invaders, who had been equipped with a huge Japanese storage of weapons and munitions that we had turned over to them in Manchuria. Following this established pattern, our State Department cut off all supplies of ammunition to the small army of Colonel Batista in Cuba, which was, of course, equipped with weapons purchased in the United States. Even ammunition that Batista had bought and already paid for was confiscated on the docks. It seemed quite clear that Batista's men did not desert, that they simply had nothing to shoot. All right, so that's where we're going to stop at this point. We're halfway through, and I'll see you soon.